And they're more the same than they are different. But the differences aren't trivial. And the thing is that differences that are small at the average can be huge at the extremes. So you might say, well, if you took the most agreeable people, say, the most compassionate people, out of 100 and segregated them, they would all be women, all of them. And if you took the least agreeable people, and those would often be people who have a criminal bent, they would all be men. And often the cultural force is driven by the extremes, not by the middle. And so you don't need huge differences in the average to produce relatively large differences in cultural manifestation. That's why there are so many men in prison compared to women. That's a big deal. And it's not the sexism of society that does that, although it might be to some degree, because like male judges give female criminals lighter sentences, for example, than female judges give female criminals. So, but no one ever talks about that. So yes, it's reasonable to note the psychological components of masculine and feminine, let's say it at a psychological and symbolic level, but to do that at the same time that you're denying biological reality and playing an anti-patriarchal game behind the scenes, and perhaps masking your Marxist anti-capitalism at the same time, that contaminates all of it so badly that you can't have a reasonable discussion. And so even the transgender issue that arose in Canada is so contaminated by the underlying ideology. Well, first of all, people would have just ignored it if that wasn't the case. But it's so contaminated by the underlying ideology that you can't trust the legislation, not a bit. So, and that was my point.
You can have equality, but then difference is also essential within that.
Yeah, unless you want sterile uniformity, which is something that only a tyrant wants. I mean, that's what the tyrant wants, is sterile uniformity. And the sterile is not only ideational sterility, but actual physiological sterility, and that's no recipe for the continuation of a culture. And you can be cynical about that and say, well, one culture is as good as the next, and you don't have any responsibility to continue your culture. But it depends on how you want to construe your life. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about the biblical stories is that these ancient people had a sense of the continuity of life across generations that we really don't have. And maybe that's a consequence of, I don't know, a too narrow individualism, something like that, or maybe or maybe it's a present-centered hedonism. But they're always acting under guidance from God, let's say, as if the consequences of their personal actions echo down the centuries, indefinitely, which they actually do, And so, and then with regards to the issue of so you need men and women to play their role in that, and they have to play their masculine and feminine roles fundamentally, even though male and female and masculine and feminine are not exactly the same idea. There's no reason to not have the differentiation. It should be encouraged, differentiation.
I feel like there's so much in the Maps of Meaning and the biblical lectures that I really want to integrate into what we're teaching, because I think it's essential stuff. Mm-hmm. For orienting yourself in the world. It just seems to be completely essential.
Right, you can't do without it. Yep. That's right, absolutely. You're adrift without it. You have to have a conscious relationship with the archetypes. Yeah. There's no way. If you don't, then you're susceptible to possession. That's basically, or to despair. Yeah. So, and no wonder.
Well, you've got to have axioms. So the right
Yes.
axioms are the archetypes.
Yes, that's why they exist.
So do you see archetypes as biological structures?
They're at least that. Yeah, they're pre-existing categories of perception. In the Kantian sense, that's a good way of thinking about it, is that, the pure empiricist thinks that you get all your information from the outside world, right? But that's not true, because you bring an a priori interpretive framework to the world. Yeah. And that's instantiated biologically, but then it's also enculturated. So separating the archetype from the underlying biological reality isn't easy. So you have this snake you have the propensity to perceive reptilian predators. The manner in which those things are represented in the culture fill those holes, essentially. And so that can
In the
take
same
a
way as the
variety of
language
different
instinct
forms.
fills
Yeah,
in
that's
the-
right, exactly.
yeah.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. Like the archetypes are manifestations of the universal grammar of emotion and motivation. That's a good way of thinking about it. Now, they may be more than that, but because, well, life has been moving forward for 3.5 billion years, and it moves forward in these patterned manners, like the dominance hierarchy, for example. So let's call that the masculine archetype. It's part of the masculine archetype. In fact, Jung's proclamation was that the female representation of the male, so that's the animus, is the dominance hierarchy. It's the patriarchy. So that's the unconscious archetype, which I think is extremely interesting given what's happened, say, in the women's movement, because that's what's projected onto men. And it can be projected in a very negative way. It doesn't have to be, but it can be. And so an animus-possessed woman treats a man as if he's the manifestation of the tyrannical patriarchy. He's a group. He's the group of men. Yeah, the group of bad men, actually.